at number 10, nailed to a tree. So starting us off here, let me just ask a question. How often would you expect to find something nailed to a tree in the woods? But more importantly, what is it that you would think would be the most likely thing to come across? There are a few things that come to mind for me, things like markers on trees so you don't get lost, maybe signs, but honestly the deeper you get into the wilderness and the further you get away from the touristy bits, the less I would expect to see much of anything nailed to a tree. However, I have not one but two scary stories from rangers that prove differently. The first one comes from Redditor homeless_homie, and they said that they randomly came across a human thumb nailed to a tree, which is disturbing on many levels and would definitely make me feel like someone was on the prowl if I came across it. The second comes from Reddit user Overlander, and theirs, believe it or not, may even be crazier. Quote, I saw a mountain lion's skin nailed to a tree with a partial skeleton below. Did this mysterious person kill the mountain lion in defense and nail its corpse to a tree to scare off others? Like, actually what happened here. Nonetheless, I would not want to come across either while I was alone in the woods. Moving on to number 9, a cry. Next up we have a story from Louie92, and while they themselves aren't a park ranger, they start off by explaining that their grandfather used to be one in Mexico and that this was a story he used to tell them when they were young. Quote, one day he said he was patrolling this ranch late at night and he heard a baby crying. Now the land is pretty flat, so he looked all ways and saw nothing. Maybe some goats out in the farm, since they sound like crying babies. As he is walking his route, he hears the same sound, looks up in the sky, and he swears he saw a witch with black clothing and everything flying towards a mountain. He panicked, ran to his car, and drove off as fast as he could. Yeah, no kidding. I mean, seeing the folklore version of a witch riding a broom in the sky would be enough to shake anyone. I wonder if that really is what he saw. Or maybe it was a demon? I guess we will never know. Next up at number 8, a truck. Our next story comes from Redditor Beards Up the Wazoo, and they say the scariest thing they have ever come across while on the job was a truck. But not just any truck. Quote, a pickup truck that had been driven off the 1200 road up in the Cascade Mountains above Washugal. It was totaled. I hiked down to it and checked it out. No signs of injury, so maybe it was just pushed down after being stolen. But behind the truck seat was a used pair of women's panties. I called the cops with its location, don't know whatever came of it. I mean, when I read this, I definitely get nervous. Had it been an accident and someone had driven off a ledge, there would likely be dead people, or at the very least signs of injury left behind. So that coupled with the random underwear is certainly not making me feel better about whoever this truck may have belonged to. Let's just hope it's not as bad as it seems. Coming in at number 7, a secret lab. So when it comes to finding creepy things in the woods, usually we're thinking of cabins, sheds, abandoned campsites. And to be fair, all of that is usually terrifying. But one thing that might not be as obvious is what our Reddit friend Radio STV found several years ago. Quote, I was out in the middle of nowhere and just before dawn I heard this huge boom that woke me out of my sleep. I packed up for a hike and set out towards the sound. After about a 5-kilometer hike, I found the smoldering remains of what I think was a moonshine still, but it could have been a lab. There was at least one very mangled body, but it looked like one guy got out in one piece. I mean, a potential lab explosion in the middle of nowhere and a mangled body in the aftermath is definitely a scary thing to come across alone in the woods. Next up at number 6, lucky day. So next up is a story from a now deleted Reddit account, and as terrifying as this would have been, it truly was their lucky day, as it could have ended so much worse. One day we're out doing a field test, which involves wandering around by yourself, checking out outcrops in an effort to figure out the underlying geological structures in the area. We're on top of this cliff, and I'm wandering around near the edge, trying to find a way to look at the horizontal layers that I'm currently standing on top of. I find a small, nearly vertical crevice that looks like it will do the trick, and I can see a little ledge about 8 feet down down that looks like I can scramble down to it and get a good picture of what's going on. So I shimmy my way down without too much problem and jump down to the ledge, landing in a mass of juniper needles and hard white things, which turn out to be lots and lots of elk, deer, and bighorn sheep bones, and lots of shedding tawny fur, and the pervasive odor of cat droppings. Needless to say, I scrambled the heck out of there as fast as my monkey arms would take me and counted myself lucky that no one was home. Long story short, I climbed into an active mountain lion den, then got out as fast as possible. Moving on to number 5. Human remains. If you watched part 1, then you're already familiar with how frighteningly common it is to find human remains in the woods. Which, you know, it's not the most comforting fact, but there you have it. And this next story from Standard Language is just as scary as any other. Quote, "For several years, I worked out in the forests of a country that experienced a genocide in the not incredibly distant past. Several times I found skulls. Once I wasn't watching where I was going, and I stumbled on something soft. I looked down and it looked like a very old sweater had been lying there forever. I poked it with my foot and dug around in the vegetation a bit, and sure enough, most of the skeleton was gone. But it was clear there were bones inside the sweater. Somehow that freaked me out more than the skulls. Now, I'm not particularly squeamish, but even so, I do hope that I never accidentally step on a sweater in the woods filled with bones of whoever died in it. That's for sure." Moving on to number 4, an animal fight. Our next story comes from Reddit friend Infinus5, and let me just say that I imagine this would be as exciting as it would be terrifying to accidentally happen upon. Quote, "We're in the middle of nowhere, no other humans for at least 40 kilometers, and we're hearing this unearthly shrieking sound. We ran out into the forest, heading down the hill towards the lowlands next to the river, and watched as a group of maybe 6 wolves chased down a bull moose." But then Reddit friend explains that another predator was close behind, a full-grown male grizzly bear. They continue, quote, "I thought I was watching a movie, like one of those things you only see in nature documentaries. We followed from a distance of maybe 250 meters while the bull moose desperately tried to cross the river, but it didn't make it. The wolves descended on their prey, dragging it onto shore while it was still kicking and shrieking in agony. The wolves didn't get their prize for long though, as the grizzly was done watching and charged the pack of wolves, which broke up at the first charge, then attacked. The massive bear broke 2 of the pack against the ground, then the others slinked back into the woods. They didn't go far from the prey's remains, knowing the bear would have its fill and they would have theirs sooner or later. That was the moment I realized why we're not at the top of the food chain." Next up at number 3, a missing person. Our next story comes from Redditor LawDog1010, and they start off by explaining that they are a wildland firefighter for the national parks in the United States, and that this discovery was easily the scariest one they came across. Quote, "Once on a fire in Southern California, we helicoptered deep into the woods, then hiked 8 or so miles. We were way out when we discovered human remains, clothes, etc. We opened the wallet to find a note, then found the thing he used with 1 bullet missing. We examined the skull and discovered the guy had used it on himself. Very creepy in person. And while that alone is scary, that wasn't even the weirdest part. Quote, a crew flew out and investigated, piecing together his ID and missing persons reports. Turns out he'd been out there for more than a decade." Moving on to number 2, a strange smell. This next story comes to us from Reddit user I'm Dead Serious, and they start off by explaining that while following a trail on a cold winter night, they suddenly smelled the strong scent of a woman's perfume. But the extra weird part was that they could only smell it in one very particular spot. Quote, "I was past it before it really registered. That's odd, I thought. I stepped back. Yes, I could smell it. I took another step. The smell was gone. When I stood in one particular spot, I could smell it, but one step either way, there was nothing, and the trail did not intersect with another. I stepped off the trail into the deep snow, and sure enough, no scent to the left or the right. The night was still, no wind. A chill went down my spine. By this time, I was looking around to see if maybe someone was hurt off the trail, or even if there was a body nearby. I called out, no response. Called again, listening carefully, and I stood there wondering what to do. And then I carried on, with my hair standing up on my neck, looking back over my shoulder. However, our Reddit friend concludes saying that it wasn't until they were writing this post that they realized there was one place they never looked. Up. And the mystery of that alone would be something that would keep me awake at night. And last up in our number 1 spot, an arm. As far as the discovery of human remains goes, which is, scary to begin with, this next story from Reddit user ConeFishNC might just be one of the creepiest and most traumatizing I've read about. Reddit friend says the scariest thing they ever found was a human arm, but the story behind it was even scarier. Quote, I was working for the city park board and a woman had been killed, and the a-hole who killed her cut her into 6 pieces and scattered them around the city. The park is big, but it's within the city, and idiot criminals seem to think they're in the Yukon out there. Little did he know, a camera above the parking area for the garden where I worked caught him. The whole thing was grisly. I had to testify as a witness. My worst memory of it was having to leap over the arm while we were waiting for the cops and shoo a kid and his grandma away so they wouldn't blunder onto the crime scene. It took me a long time to get over the sense that any kind of branch or log on the forest could be a person. I still hate mannequin hands and arms. I don't blame them. It's one thing to find a creepy bone in the woods and another to find a dismembered limb that ends with you having to go to court in a homicide case.
And we're gonna kick off this list with what I'm just gonna call the zombie. Reddit user Love is a Love an Axe uploaded this image a couple years back, and it's pretty haunting. They wrote, my uncle has a trail cam at my old grandparents' house, which are both dead, and the house is abandoned. The camera takes 3 pics every time a motion is detected. This thing only appears in 1 out of 3 of the photos. They also elaborated in a comment down below saying, for more info for anyone wondering, my uncle was up there and left. The trail cam caught him leaving in his car completely. The trail cam takes pictures so fast it looks like stop motion if looked through quickly, and this thing walks up 6 minutes after he left. It's only in a few pics, and the time says the thing was only on screen for 1 second. In the next picture, it's just gone. Never walked out of frame, just went away. And you know what, if all that's true, then this is pretty freaky. Whatever this figure is does not appear to be normal. Its limbs seem all messed up, its clothes look all ragged. It looks like an undead corpse roaming around in the middle of the night. Number 9, the large creature. This next image was posted to Reddit by user Adjacent Gunman and shows something. It's hard to make out what's going on here, but the user said it was taken on a trail cam on his property and looks to be a very tall creature of some sort holding a coyote by the throat. This second image is a bit more brightened and you can definitely see the thing's eyes pop out a bit more, but it still blends in with the darkness. You don't get a sense of what its body looks like at all. So if it is a Sasquatch of some kind, it has some pretty dark fur. Some commenters said it could be a hunter on his property, but the uploader said it's not possible, or at least highly unlikely, as the placement of the eyes beside his cabin would make whatever this thing is about 8 feet tall. Now, looking at the coyote's limbs, they look very angular, almost photoshopped perhaps, or maybe whatever the creature holding it is, like it's maybe blocking part of its body. I don't know. It's hard to tell. Let us know in the comments what you think. This footage was uploaded to the YouTube channel Jimmy B Trail Cams and shows what looks to be a large, hairy creature walking across the screen through the trees. Jimmy B uploads all kinds of trail cam videos in Birch Bay, Washington. There are videos of foxes, wolves, hawks, owls, and this. And that's kind of what sells it for me. Like, this isn't someone who just seems to be a Bigfoot enthusiast. He just seems to have a passion for wildlife of all kinds. Probably wasn't even trying to capture something mysterious like this, but just happened to. And the footage is not super clear, but for a Bigfoot video, you do see quite a bit. The bar is not very high for Bigfoot videos. You see that the creature moves with this classic Bigfoot gait. Its arms hang by its sides. It seems to have like a pretty long strides. He posted an update after uploading this footage saying 4 of his 8 trail cameras were missing the day after this footage was taken. So that's mysterious. Number 7, the skunk ape. Just recently, this image captured on a Florida game cam was shared online. The image was taken in Ocala National Park in a hunter's food plot and shows some kind of ape-like creature. Definitely ain't a deer. And I gotta say, if someone is just in a costume here, good job. It looks pretty convincing. I don't look at this image and go, oh, that's a gorilla costume. The fur just looks too, for lack of a better word, real. And the face looks like an actual animal. The dude who shared the image said, looks almost like it's holding a baby with its fingers on the mother's nose. I can kind of see that, but what do you all think? Let us know in the comments once again. At our number 6 spot, we have what I like to call too many deer. Now, this image certainly isn't as ominous as some of the others on this list, and I am quite fond of deer. They're majestic, they're beautiful and elegant animals, but there's something a little unsettling about this image. Like, there's just too many goddamn deer in this forest. It looks like a deer army. It's reminding me of Saruman's Uruk-hai, like swarming the forest to capture Frodo here. Right? Isn't everyone else thinking that? Looking at this picture? Everywhere you look, there's another deer. They just go on for miles, it looks like. I guess too much of anything, though, is kinda icky, right? Like, take cats, for example. Adorable on their own, but like only to a point. Too many, and things get a little uncomfortable. The stereotypical crazy cat lady, it's a thing for a reason. I also think the fact that every single one of them is staring directly into the camera makes it kinda off-putting. This was obviously taken with the flash on, so it's a deer in headlights kind of situation, but looking at this picture, I still have a bit of like a, oh god, like, what do you want from me kind of feeling. Next on the list, we have the ghost. So take a look at this image. What do you see? Well, obviously there is, once again, another deer in the foreground looking up at something. But just what the hell is that in the background? It's hard to make out exactly what this odd shape is. To me, it looks like a naked Voldemort howling at the moon. It looks ghostly, too, only the bust is fully formed. The rest of it looks like it fades out, almost like mist. Maybe there's a pond behind the deer, and that's what this thing is, like, maybe submerged in? It's hard to tell, but this is kind of a freaky image. A pale, bald ghost screaming in pain behind a confused deer. I can make out what looks to be a brow ridge, a wide open mouth. Whatever it is, it looks like to have maybe a gaunt, almost skeletal face. This would actually make for a perfect like black metal album cover. Just throw some overly complex, indistinguishable text on there and you're good. Next up, we have the clown. These mysterious images have been floating around online since at least 2010. They could even have been taken before. No one is exactly sure. We're not even 100% sure where the trail cam photos were taken, so this could very well be a hoax. But if it isn't, and someone's trail cam just happened to snap a couple pictures of some mysterious man in a clown costume roaming around in the forest, then that makes these images very nightmarish. The image was used in a news story about the string of weird clown sightings that happened in the summer of 2016. Anyone remember that? But it was discovered that the image was actually uploaded to the Field and Stream Facebook page in 2010, a well-known hunting and fishing page. So whoever this was, they were donning their clown outfit and heading out to the forest long before that magical clown-crazed summer of 2016 that we all miss. Some say he was just joking around. Godswallop, in my opinion. Nope, I reckon he's still out there, clowning around and carrying on. But one thing's absolutely certain. Something about this image stumped the internet. That's why it's famous. That's why nobody knows his name. He's the clown who hid. Number 3, we have the werewolf. In May of 2022, at the Amarillo Zoo in Texas, one of the cameras picked up this creature at around 1:30 in the morning. Now, whatever this thing is, it was walking around outside of the zoo, so it wasn't likely to be one of their animals unless something escaped. And if it is an escaped animal, Well, what exactly is it? Like a lemur wearing a lion mask? It seems to be walking on its hind legs, so unless the camera just happened to snap a four-legged creature while it stood upright for a brief moment, it's hard to imagine this being a wolf or a dog. Speaking of wolves though, a lot of folks have been comparing this to maybe a werewolf, and I can definitely see that. It looks to be pointy ears, it's got a mane of fur on its back. I also think it looks maybe a bit alien, but again, let us know what you think down below. I think if we all put our heads together, we can crack this case. Coming in at second place, we have another ghost. This image was captured in Whiteman Hill in Wayland, New York, and was shared by Kelly Morgan, who found the image on her brother's trail cam. It depicts some sort of ghostly figure roaming around in front of the camera. There's some sort of beauty in this image a little bit. The figure looks like it's glowing a little bit. Morgan made a statement saying that her grandmother told her a story about three men who took the life of a 17-year-old on her wedding day in 1882. Apparently the girl was buried in a cemetery nearby. So could this image be the tortured soul of that bride wandering through the woods in the dead of night, or is it just a hoax? And finally, we have the rake. In this clip shared by TikTok user CryptTalker, we see a strange, lanky creature crawling through someone's backyard on all fours. It seems to resemble the famous rake internet phenomenon where the most famous creepy trail camera picture comes from. This one here, yeah, we've all seen that image, right? A gaunt, pale, spindly looking creature staring into the camera in the dead of the night. Well, this thing looks kinda like that. I'd say it could be someone just walking around on all fours, but whatever this thing is, it's incredibly thin, way too small to be human. All I know is I don't like this thing. It looks like an even longer, lankier, creepier version of Gollum. How many fantasy movie references did I make in that list? I think like 4. I don't know how Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings got in there, but is what it is.
Starting us off in our number 10 spot, we have animal corpses. So there are certain things you expect to find in the wilderness, and to be honest, one of the more likely things is dead animals, but not in the way that ripe OTCDXVI found them. Quote, I'm a ranger at Yellowstone. A couple weeks ago, I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road, and even further to the park boundary. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, no raggedness at the severance. Perfectly intact. This is weird because I have seen wolf and bear spoils, and I used to find cougar prey remains with radio tracking just after the cougar made them, but this was not any of those things. The head was completely uneaten. Eyes, tongue, everything intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. No catching, no droppings, right smack in the trail. But again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was just a doe, so it had no antlers, plus why leave it in the trail? It was just strange and creepy top to bottom. Coming in at number 9. A midnight pee. This next one is scary in the way that it could have been a literal life or death situation, but thankfully it's just a crazy story that shiny_brine gets to share with all of us now. Quote, my scariest wilderness encounter was at about 2 a.m. while maintaining a fire line on a 300-acre fire caused by a lightning strike. I needed to take a pee, and the rule is you don't urinate on fire, so I walked over towards a stump outside the fire line. I was about 50 feet away from the stump when it walked away. It was a black bear. I can only imagine the feeling in the pit of Reddit users' stomach when they realized what was going on, and thank God the bear didn't think or want to attack them. I wonder if they ever peed in the woods at night after that incident. Next up at number 8, an abandoned tent. Next up is a story from Redditor Not So Single Buck, and while it might not sound as disturbing as some of the others on this list, I think stumbling across any kind of abandoned living situation can be a little unnerving. Quote, the oddest thing was the abandoned camp next to the trail. I was surprised as all get out to walk around the corner one day and find a tent set up directly next to the trail. The trail ran along a nice stream and was a very tranquil spot. Inside I found a cloth, sleeping bag, some some dirty clothes, lots of food, and a teddy bear. Everything reeked of cigarette smoke. I was reluctant to confiscate everything and leave the individual out there with nothing, but I did take all the food and pack it to a secure food storage box along the way back to my cabin. I left a note explaining where I had taken the food and that they needed to move camp. The Reddit user then explains they left it for about 2 weeks, but when they returned it, it was like no one had ever been there since. It was as if it was completely untouched. Also, I have to say the mixture of a teddy bear and it reeking of cigarette smoke makes you wonder who was there in the first place. Next up at number 7, a shed. Similarly to our last point, while sheds aren't inherently creepy in theory, anything abandoned in the middle of the woods is never a super great thing to come across as a general rule of thumb. Or at least in the case of one former Reddit user who posted saying the most disturbing thing they ever discovered on the job as a park ranger was, quote, a shed behind an abandoned house with a steel reinforced door broken off the hinges. The windows of the shed were boarded up from the outside. The only thing inside the shed was a queen-size bed with shredded, partly singed, white sheets. I mean, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a starter kit for a kidnapping and killing sort of situation. No? Coming in at number 6. A weird man. This next story about a bone-chilling discovery comes from Redditor Senor Puffy Pants, and they start off by explaining that they were in charge of leading a group of middle schoolers and their instructor up to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. However, the first night they saw something that made them question their sanity. Quote, everything around me was rather bright from the moon and from the position I was in. I could see down the trail we hiked to get to the top. I laid there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do. I waited just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. In the end, Reddit friend said around 3:30 he stood up and went back down the trail he came from, but that he practically couldn't sleep the rest of the trip. Coming in at number 5, the haunted site. This next scary park ranger discovery comes from user The Reluctant Ranger, and they start off by stating that they are a desert park ranger. Quote, volunteers at one of my parks called us to report a still smoldering / smoking car in one of our remote campsites. It was normal for stolen cars to get abandoned and burned. We went to look, gawked for a couple minutes while waiting for the fire department. After a couple minutes standing there, it became very apparent there was a body in the front seat. After an additional look around, food wrappers, rope, and numerous other strange items were found. It seems like whoever was in the front seat had been bound and shot. Police came and cleaned it up, but didn't find any answers. We refer to that as the haunted site now. It is the most popular in that tiny little park. Coming in at number 4, a stalking cougar. If you grew up near the woods like I did, then you were also probably told on a daily basis to watch out for cougars. And so this next one from Smokey the Marshmallow feels especially terrifying to me. Quote, the scariest experience I had as a backcountry park ranger in Washington state was being stalked by a cougar for a day and a half. I was hiking up an unpopular trail up to an old shelter and had that creepy being watched feeling. I had seen fairly fresh cougar scratches and droppings along the trail, but that's pretty common up here, so I wasn't worried at all. That night I camped at the shelter, which only had 3 walls and a roof. I felt uneasy all night and hardly slept. At one point I arranged my emergency foil tarp around my sleeping bag so at least I could hopefully hear something if it approached me as I slept. The next day I found fresh droppings and scratches on the trail I had hiked in on. About a mile past the shelter, I found a mostly eaten deer in some dense brush off the trail. Cougars often keep deceased prey stashes throughout their territory for later snacking. Now, a cougar won't usually tangle with a human, but here I am, a 5' 4-foot tall, 100-pound sack of flesh and bones at least 13 miles out from any other humans. I decided to cut short my 3-day trip and hot-footed it out there. The last 2 hours of hiking through dusk in a dense forest was the most hair-raising hike I've ever had. I didn't know I was even capable of being that hyper-vigilant. Next up at number 3 is a disturbing camp. Next up is a story from Reddit user Genesis Pro Tech, who discovered a situation while they were looking for missing teens that would have made me worry for everyone's life involved. Quote, "I head out in the general direction the teens had set off in. We'd been hiking for most of the day and seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point when we start noticing odd things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings in the trees, a stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't on the regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. Mind you, we're still looking for these teens." From there they say that while creeped out, they continued with the hike until they reached a place to camp overnight. However, the next morning, when they woke up, Reddit user says, quote, "I noticed a bit of shirt that had caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close to the teens, when a radio call comes through saying that they had just been found 20 kilometers east of us. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind, and we wasted no time hiking out of those woods." Coming in at number 2. Human teeth. This next story comes from Reddit user The Copy Paste Life, and only gets creepier the more you find out about it. Quote, "Our park lets kids from school in so they can look for animals in the forest and the streams. One day, a kid finds molars. The teeth looked like human molars, but the teacher said they were deer's. I dismissed it and completely forgot about it. But 2 days later, they found a corpse with a smashed skull and jaw in another part of the park, and all its teeth were missing. I mean, first of all, how long was that corpse there? Secondly, did they ever find out who this person was? I mean, I would not be too keen on coming to work after finding that, and having no clue how it ended up there is all I'm saying." And last up in our number 1 spot is a man. As much as this would be a very scary thing to come across in a forest, it would also be very depressing and incredibly traumatic. According to Reddit user Rogue Leader 096, the worst, most unsettling discovery they ever made on the job was a dead man who had tragically taken his own life. Quote, "I am a seasonal ranger for my local forest district. The rest of the rangers say we find about 1 victim a year, and when we go around opening parks each day, we drive through to make sure everything is okay. In this instance, I was driving through and had just lost sight of the road when I saw a man." Reddit friend then goes on to describe that the man was in the trees and that he knew immediately what he had discovered. Quote, "I called the cops, but the medical examiner took an hour or so to show up, and he was the only one with a ladder long enough to cut the guy down. So I stared at him, waiting for an hour." I mean, it's just straight up awful.
Starting off this countdown, we have the deer head. Posted on Reddit by RipeOTCDXVI, they claim to be a forest ranger at Yellowstone National Park. One day they were out exploring a part of the park called Lamar Valley, which is about 11 miles from the nearest road. While on the trail, they stumbled upon something very shocking: a perfectly severed deer head. There was no blood whatsoever, and it was cut off with precision. Now obviously, since this is a park, rangers come across dead animals all the time, but never in such perfect condition. Also, the head was completely uneaten. So now the question is, who did this? Why did they do this? And how did they do this? Moving on to number 9, we have the abandoned tent. Reddit user Not So Single Buck was at work one day when he came across a campsite that was set outside of the designated campsite area, which is against the rules of the park, so he went to investigate. In the tent, he found a sleeping bag, some dirty clothes, lots of canned food, and a teddy bear. The whole tent smelled of cigarette smoke. There was nothing that he could do though until the individual returned. He didn't want to wait all day, so he just took the open food to prevent animals from being attracted to it and left a note explaining where he had taken the food and why. 2 weeks later he returned to the tent and it had remained untouched. As a result, him and his team cleared out the tent. Whatever happened to the person staying in the tent remains a huge mystery. Did a wild animal get to them? Did they fall off a cliff? A body was never found, so we may never know. Coming in at number 8, we have the wolf pack. This story happened 3 years ago by an old-timey forest ranger that worked in Montana. He was out roaming around on his ATV when he saw an older lady in the distance. She was screaming as 6 wolves closed in around her. The ranger drove down to her as fast as he could, yelling and honking, trying to scare away the wolves. But when he got there, she was nowhere to be found. The only sign of her was a single ring with a black stone which was on the ground where the woman was standing. Seems like the wolves got to her and carried her away. Coming in at number 7, we have the strange blue lights. This person used to work as a ranger at Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico. There's a place on this ranch that is said to be haunted. There's a number of urban legends surrounding this place, like, oh, it's the portal to the underworld, or it's home to an ancient cursed burial ground, you get it. There's also this very eerie legend saying that on some nights, blue lights can be seen. One story claims that a hiker saw an eerie figure on the trail. The figure was tall and emitting a blue light. Well, legend goes that the blue lights are coming from a shaman that guards the ground. Anyways, obviously these are just legends, right? Well, one night the ranger was out with a scout troop when they saw a bunch of weird lights coming from a trail. These were the infamous blue lights talked about in multiple legends. Everyone was so freaked out that they got out of there as fast as they could. Now, let's just say that they're all believers. In our 6th spot, we have these skinned animals. So a couple of years ago, 2 forest rangers were on their way to a far location when it got dark out. As a result, they had to camp overnight. But during the night, they were woken up by the sound of footsteps right outside of their tent. All of a sudden, they heard a number of people yell, "Get out!" The 2 rangers packed up as fast as they could and got the hell out of there. The next morning, the cops went to check out the area and found 4 skinned animals nailed to the trees surrounding their campsite. Okay, that is horrifying, and I have a number of questions. Number 1, who the heck were these people? Number 2, what were they doing there? Number 3, what the heck? And number 4, what the heck? Seriously, that is so messed up. Were they doing some satanic ritual and the forest rangers ruined it, or what? We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Wendigo. Imagine going out camping with some friends and encountering a Wendigo during your trip. Wouldn't that be insane and terrifying? Like if you agree. Well, this happened to a forest ranger and a bunch of his friends. So the group went out camping and all was going well. Until the second night. During the night, all 4 of the men woke up to a loud, high-pitched scream. They assumed it was just a coyote. But the next morning, they were in for a surprise. By their campsite, they found a bunch of animal guts everywhere. The ranger described it as if there was a bomb in an animal and then it went off. There was just fur, blood, and flesh everywhere. That night is when they came across the monster that devoured the animal. They were out investigating a sound when they saw a weird tall figure move in the distance. It was about 6 feet tall and did not look like an animal and did not look like a human. When the creature spotted the men, it took off in a flash. They believe that they encountered a Wendigo. Coming in at number 4, we have the man in the woods. This next individual was a park ranger on a small island. The island could only be accessed by a private boat. During the summer, there would be hordes of people there, but during the off-season, the ranger would be the only one on the island. One night, the ranger decided to take a hike around the entire island. Yeah, at night, when it's dark. He thought it would be a fun challenge for himself. Plus, there was no cell or internet service, so you know, what else could you really do? While he was out on his hike, he heard a noise coming from behind him. He turned around and standing behind him was a crazy old man. He was a super pale and super tall man with dark hair. The man gave out a creepy smile and then cackled. The ranger ran for his life and this crazy man ran after him until the ranger made it back safely to his cabin. In the morning, he went back on the trail he had been on, and there were no sets of other footprints, only his own. as if the man had never been there at all. Moving on to number 3, we have the polar bears. So this next individual was a park ranger in the northern part of Ontario, Canada. In the middle of the night, she woke up to hear something outside of her tent. She opened her eyes and saw the head of a polar bear peeking into her tent. Imagine waking up and seeing that thing breathing in your face. Like, what would you do? Well, the correct answer is don't panic and don't frighten the bear. Thankfully, that's what the ranger did. She stayed calm and eventually the bear left the tent. That could have ended much worse for this woman. She got lucky. Like, I think I would have peed myself, seriously. In our second spot, we have the river accident. A man named Kevin Uxbridge used to be a ranger at Yosemite. One day, he was making his way through the gate, which was along a river, when he heard a huge commotion. People were yelling and screaming and crying. Well, turns out there was a husband and wife standing by the river. The husband was taking a picture of his wife and kept telling her to back up, you know, so he could get a good shot. Well, she ended up backing up too far and she fell into the river. The river was pretty violent that day, so within seconds she was swept under. It took the ranger and firefighters 2 months before they could find her body. The worst part? Her body was found in the swimming hole when the river had settled. People were swimming in there just days before they found her. And in our number 1 spot, we have the ghostly body. This next story comes from a trail ranger. One time, he noticed that there was a bunch of illegally placed wildlife cameras around, so he went around taking them down. Things were going well until he started hearing a bunch of weird voices. He hopped back on his ATV, but the battery was disconnected, so he couldn't drive off. He was then stuck there waiting for someone to pick him up. They were an hour away and it was getting dark. He decided to sit down and make a small fire. Before he knew it, the voices were back, this time getting louder and louder. Finally, he could hear what was being said. It was 2 hunters arguing over a kill. That's when all of a sudden he heard a loud bang. It was a gunshot. After that, he smothered the fire and hid until his coworkers arrived. The next day, the two came back with the police to investigate the area. After about an hour of looking, they came across a shallow grave. In it, they found a dead man who had been shot in the face. The freakiest part? It was just the skeleton of the man. He had been there for years. So it seems like he heard ghosts reenacting the murder that happened years ago or something like that. I don't know, it is so freaky.
And we're kicking off this video with stairs. This is something that a lot of you have probably heard of before. There have been many stories and images surfacing online of people, as well as park rangers, coming across stairs in the middle of the forest, leading to some pretty surreal, haunting kind of images. These stairs are often found deep in the woods and can be made of a variety of materials, including concrete and wood. The stairs appear to have been constructed by human hands and appear to be in rather good condition, even though they are often located in areas where there are no buildings or signs of human activity. A supposed paranormal stories surrounding these stairs suggest that they are haunted or cursed, and that those who climb them are doomed to a terrible fate. Some claim that the stairs are remnants of long abandoned structures, while others believe that they are portals to other dimensions or the work of supernatural entities. And I gotta say, I mean, just seeing stairs in the middle of a forest, that'd be pretty eerie for me too. I'd be just a little bit freaked out. The search for the missing teens. Reddit user Genesis Pro Tech shared this story. There had been a group of teenagers who went on a camping trip but did not return at the scheduled time. Worried about their safety, Genesis Pro Tech and his good friend, along with a search and rescue professional who knew the area well, were called to assist with the search efforts. After hiking for most of the day and covering about 35 kilometers into the woods, the search party began to notice some strange things. They came across sticks that were carved into spears and stuck in the ground, odd carvings on the trees, and a child's stuffed animal hanging from a tree. These items were all freshly carved, indicating that someone had been in the area recently. The thing is, this wasn't on any of the regular trails in the area, and it was far from any roads. Despite their growing unease, the search party continued to hike through the woods, hoping to find the missing teenagers. As night fell, they set up camp, still on edge from the unsettling things they'd seen earlier, and after a restless night, they woke up at dawn and prepared to continue the search. While packing up the gear though, they found a piece of ripped clothing and some shoe prints nearby. They thought, hey, maybe they were close to finding the missing teens. But then they received a radio call that the teenagers had been found about 20 kilometers away to the east, and that they were calling the search party back. They were pretty relieved about the teens being found, but understandably shaken at the same time. What was all that stuff they'd come across in the middle of nowhere? Next up we have Stalked by a Cougar. A Redditor by the name of Smokey the Marshmallow shared what they described as the scariest incident they had experienced as a park ranger. In Washington state, the ranger had been hiking up an unpopular trail leading to an old shelter where he had a strange feeling he was being watched. Although he had seen fresh cougar scratches and droppings along the trail, which were common in the area, he wasn't worried at first. That night, he camped at the shelter, which had only 3 walls and a roof. He felt a little uneasy throughout the night and didn't sleep much. In an attempt to feel safer, he arranged his emergency foil tarp around his sleeping bag, hoping to hear something if it approached him as he slept. The next day, the ranger found fresh cougar droppings and scratches on the trail he had hiked on. He continued on the trail and found a mostly eaten deer in some dense brush just off the trail. This was an indication that this cougar was nearby, and the ranger began to feel pretty uneasy, as he could probably imagine, given he was at least 13 miles away from civilization. As a result, he decided to just shorten his 3-day trip and quickly made his way out of the area. Probably a smart idea. Badlands National Park, located in South Dakota, is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the United States. Many visitors and park rangers have reported paranormal activities in the park, including ghostly sightings and eerie sounds. The area is known for its rugged terrain, deep canyons, and eroded rock formations, which have become the perfect setting for various ghost stories. It is also home to a dark history of violence and tragedy, leading to many rumors of possible paranormal activity. The area was once a haven for outlaws and bandits as well, who would often take refuge in the rugged landscape. It's rumored that the spirits of these notorious criminals still haunt the park, with visitors reporting strange noises, apparitions, and just feelings of being watched. Visitors have also reported strange lights and unexplained sounds and eerie shadows within the park. The Deer Head. A ranger at Yellowstone National Park posted the following story on Reddit. They stated that they had been exploring the remote Lamar Valley, situated miles away from the nearest road and the park boundary. While wandering on the trail, the ranger came across a bizarre sight: a perfectly severed deer head in the middle of the path. There was no evidence of blood, and the head seemed to be untouched and intact. The person had previously come across the kills of bears and wolves, and even tracked the kills of cougars in South Dakota, but this was something else entirely. The head was of a doe and didn't have antlers, so kind of unlikely that it was a hunter committed this act, and it didn't make sense for someone to even leave the head in the middle of the trail. Just a perfectly severed, intact head. Yeah. Pretty weird. Next up, we have the booby trap. In April 2012, a U.S. Forest Service law enforcement officer named James Schaufler was on patrol in a popular recreation area located off Big Springs Trail in Provo Canyon, Utah. While on foot, he came across what looked to be a tripwire, and to his horror, he discovered a primitive booby trap that was set to activate when said tripwire was crossed. The device was made of a large rock and had sharpened sticks on it, forming kind of like a spiked ball that, of course, could hit an unsuspecting person and cause some serious harm. After dismantling the trap, he found another tripwire designed to send someone falling into a bed of sharpened wooden spikes, very Mortal Kombat style. Schaufler's quick thinking and sharp eyesight prevented a potentially very serious incident from happening, as the booby traps were located only half a mile from the recreation area's parking lot. It was fortunate that no one was injured, especially since there was a child's birthday party being held in the area at the time. Yikes. The traps were dismantled, and Schaufler's actions were instrumental, obviously, in keeping people safe while enjoying the area's natural beauty. Thank you, James. The next story comes from us to another Reddit user, Shiny Brian, who picked quite the spot to relieve himself. He had a job fighting forest fires in the Pacific Northwest and described his scariest encounter as such. My scariest wilderness encounter was about 2 a.m. while maintaining a fire line on a 300-acre fire caused by a lightning strike. I needed to take a number one, and the rule is you don't take a number one on the fire. So I walked over towards towards a stump outside the fire line. I was about 50 feet away from the stump when it walked away. It was a black bear. I feel like I would have just shrunk into myself if this ever happened to me. I mean, just seeing a stump you were looking at move, first of all, is scary, and then to see it's a bear, yeah, no thanks. Alright, Lake Crescent in Olympic National Park is steeped in legend and ghost stories. One of the most popular legends surrounding the lake is that it was created when part of Mount Storm King fell onto a battlefield, crushing the combatants and creating the bed of the lake, according to legend anyway. However, a more recent and factual story is that of the Lady of the Lake. In 1940, the body of a woman was found floating in the lake. Her body was eerily well preserved, likely due to the natural process of saponification, which gave her skin a kind of waxy texture. The woman was later identified Haley Latham Illingworth, a local tavern server who had disappeared in 1937. Her husband Monty was identified as the culprit after authorities found strangulation bruises on her body. Despite the mystery being solved though, visitors to the area still report seeing the ghost of her lingering on the shores of Lake Crescent, making it one of Washington's most haunted trails, supposedly. Next up, we have the bear attack. Jordan Carberry, a Canadian park ranger in Bella Coola, British Columbia, had come across some bear cubs in a tree. Never a good sign. You do not want to come across grizzly bear cubs in the wild, as cute as they are, because where they are, the mother is close by, and she does not want to see you. And this was no exception. One of these cubs happened to fall out of the tree and caught the attention of the protective mother bear, who began charging towards him. The grizzly bear tackled him from behind, picked him up by his head. Bear then picked him up again by his thigh and dropped him down repeatedly. Using what he had learned from a defensive training class though, the park ranger Carberry kicked the bear in the face as hard as he could and managed to create enough space to run back to his house. Since he didn't have cell service though, Carberry actually had to drive himself to the hospital with one arm over his belly, just telling himself repeatedly not to pass out. Despite his injuries, Carberry did recover, and during recovery was quoted as saying he felt fan-freaking-tastic. So amazing. The last story here, this is a personal story, at least one that happened to a buddy of mine. I call it the Waving Man. So my buddy used to be a camp counselor. So yeah, not a park ranger, but hey, close enough. Anyway, he took kids out on portaging trips. It used to be like days-long trips. We'd canoe, and then you'd traverse through the forest with the canoe, and then you'd canoe again. That's what it's called. Anyway, so one day they're canoeing, they're getting to their next site, and they happen across this man on the side of the shore, and he's kind of asking my buddy, hey, where are you guys camping and all this stuff? And my buddy Max, he doesn't really tell him because obviously he's got kids with him. He doesn't want some guy coming around their campsite. But they make it to their campsite that night. They set up the fire, they set up their tents. The kids go to bed. Him and his fellow camp counselor are in their tent. And then they start to hear what sounds like footsteps kind of walking around their campsite. And they're thinking like, okay, maybe it's one of the kids who's up or something like that. Unzip their tent. Nobody. Totally empty campsite. Now they're obviously a little bit freaked out, right? Zip up the tent again. They hear those footsteps once again. They're like, do you hear that? Yeah, like I hear there's something. And keep in mind, they got kids with them. So they have to, obviously protect the kids. My buddy Max pulls out an axe he had with them, set up a fire, and they just stay up all night, just waiting for whoever this is to come out or, might have to use that axe. They were really freaked out. Anyway, night goes by fine, no one ends up showing up. Head back on their canoes the next morning, and as they're heading down the river, they see that same man they met the day before just on the side of the shore, just waving and smiling at them. So, I don't know. Anyway.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have Through Him. This one comes from Reddit user SuperDan23. Now I thought I'd start off with a really strong one. Hopefully this doesn't creep you guys out too much. SuperDan said, I worked at a summer camp where the cabins were arranged in a circle, a center building that was used for showers and bathrooms. One night, one of my campers, about 12 years old, asked to go to the bathroom, just as we had all gotten into bed. I tell him to take his bunkmate and to go quickly. The bathroom building is about 100 feet away. The kids are kind of dorking around like kids do, and they take off for the bathroom running. All of a sudden I hear screams that still haunt me. Hysterical, choking for air, horror movie screams. I jump up and run out, and I see the two boys sitting on the ground right outside the bathrooms, and they are kind of holding each other. After a few minutes they calm down enough and they say they ran through a man. They say he appeared right before they got to the bathroom door and was standing in the doorway. They didn't have enough space to stop, and when they put their hands up they went through him and into the door. They said there was cold air around him, and that was it. He was gone. They said he had a suit on and slicked black hair and was smiling. We had to call the parents and they both went home the next morning. No kid goes home from summer camp, man. It still freaks me out. Next up at number 9 now we have Good Bones. Now this is a short one, but it's packed with just as much creepiness as the rest of our stories in today's video. It comes from Reddit user The Copy Paste Life. They said, our park lets kids from school in so they can look for animals in the forest and the streams. One day a kid finds molars. The teeth look like human molars, but the teacher said it was a deer's. I dismissed it and completely forgot about it. 2 days later they found a corpse with a smashed skull and jaw in another part of the park. All of its teeth were missing. Local newspaper covered the story, but all they had to say was, thank the spooky skeletons for good bones and teeth. Okay, so with that story, the bones and teeth and the skull were all creepy, but do you know what else is creepy? That newspaper. Who hears about a potential murder victim and jokes about spooky skeletons? That is really creepy. I'm just saying. Moving on to number 8 now, we have Womp. This one was posted to Reddit by OG Dinosaur. Now he admits that he's not a ranger, but rather an archaeologist who heads out to the wilderness to do studies, but in my opinion his story is too good to miss out. He said a few years back we were doing a massive survey in the middle of nowhere in the interior of BC. All the crew had gone home and it was just my boss and myself left for a few days to follow up and confirm some coordinates and finish some mapping. We head out from the motel an hour or so into the bush, middle of nowhere along deactivated logging roads. Closest town is miles and miles away. We hike out to this one area we had found a site at a few weeks previously. Now for some reason the whole area just felt off. So we get down to business, and about 15 minutes after being hunched over mapping, there is this weird, deafening whomp sound. Like I could feel pressure in my ears. I immediately looked at my boss about 20 feet away, and he is white as a ghost staring back at me. Standing there, it happens again. Whomp. Ear pressure and chest pressure, like I was just squeezed. Chills all over my body and every hair is standing on end. My boss just looks at me and says, let's go. We grab all of our stuff and speed hike back to the truck. We never discussed it again. No clue what it was, but I have never been so freaked out in my life. 10 years later and I still get the chills. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Black Magic. This one comes from Reddit user Rooston Dayard. It's about to step up a gear here, guys. She said, I was a ranger at a coastal park in South Carolina, down on the islands. I saw the aftermath of some truly creepy black magic. When you open the park, you must also begin with a complete park tour, including riding down the beach. Several times in the 2 years I worked there, I came across turkeys chained up and chickens left in homemade crates for the high tide to come in and kill. Strange artifacts would always be scattered around the crest of where high tide hit. Everything from random bones to swatches of clothing could be found. Half the staff that worked there were Gula. They would tell me that was black magic, not to be confused with root magic. Black magic would be the bad kind, where you have to sacrifice life and are asking for something bad to happen. Root magic is a good magic, where you're just asking for love, health, luck, etc., and not sacrificing a life. It always freaked me out seeing it and bummed me out to clean it up. Next up at number 6 now, we have the jungle spirit. Now do you guys believe in the spirits living in trees? If you don't, you might find this one interesting. It comes from Reddit user Morgan Explosion, who said, I was working at a survey station deep in the Malaysian jungle in Borneo, 4 hours in 4x4s to reach this spot from the nearest village. I was sleeping in one of the dorms with some of the rangers we were working with, 5 people total in the dorm. That night, I was having a nightmare and woke up at about 2 AM to the sound of footsteps outside. Whatever it was fairly big and sounded bipedal. It stopped right outside the window, so I'm staring back at the window trying hard to see. It was pitch black in the whole station since it runs on solar power and the batteries give out around midnight. Suddenly, one of the rangers shifted in her bed, making a noise, and I could hear whatever it was running away quite fast. Being a rather skeptical person in general, general, I woke up and asked the rangers the next day about it. They adamantly believed that it was a jungle spirit coming to check us out. The station stood on stilts, so the window sits about 10 feet off the ground. I asked about the possibility of it being a wild animal, but they said the only thing big enough to make that large of a footprint would have been a sun bear or a cloud leopard. They said it's generally unheard of for those animals to make it that close to the survey station, since there are usually people milling about. The rangers have heard the footsteps before, and they firmly believe that a jungle spirit was roaming about the site. Moving on to number 5 now, we have missing teens. This one comes from Genesis Pro Tech. This story is a reminder to not always jump to conclusions. They said there was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return time from a camping trip. A good friend and I knew the area very well, so one of the search team and rescue guys we're friends with called us in to assist in the search. Him and I head out in the general direction the teens had set off in. We'd been hiking for almost a day and we'd seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point when we start noticing odd things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings on the trees, a child's stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't even on the regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. Mind you, we're still looking for these teens. We kept on hiking and eventually made camp for the night, still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settle down anyway and go to sleep. We get up with the sunrise, hoping to cover more ground before it gets too hot. We pack up the gear and get ready to go when I noticed a bit of shirt that had caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close to the teens, when a radio call comes through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometers east of us, and they're calling everybody back from the search. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind. We wasted no time hiking out of those woods. Next up at number 4 now, we have the crowbar. This one came from Reddit user Tinge of the Ginge, which is a great name, I must say. This one sounds more like an actual horror movie though. They said, I'm a field biologist and my job takes me to some fairly remote places. I have 2 favorite stories. The first was the time I was surveying a remote restoration site near an old trail and heard someone walking up a nearby path. All the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, so I grabbed all my stuff and started casually walking down the trail like I belonged there. I turned the corner and there was a shirtless guy swinging a crowbar around in circles, and when he saw me he started yelling, "I've got a crowbar, I've got a crowbar." I think I nodded at him, squeaked something like "nice crowbar," and then ran the mile or so back to my truck. And that's the reason why I always carry mace and a big knife now. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the head. This one comes from Reddit user RipeOTCDXVI. They're actually a ranger at Yellowstone National Park. That's the one that looks amazing, but it could blow up at any moment and end humanity. Yeah, that one. Anyway, they said, a couple weeks ago I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road and even further to the park boundary. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, no raggedness at the severance, perfectly intact. Now this is weird because I have seen wolf and bear kills, and I used to find cougar kills in SD with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This was not any of those things. This head was completely uneaten. Eyes, tongue, everything was intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. No catching, no scat, right in the middle of the trail, but again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers, plus why leave it in the trail? The whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clean deer head right on the path. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the howling. This one comes from Reddit user Jack Mac. He said, I have seen weird lights, heard weird sounds, found weird stuff in the woods before, but the one that sticks out was years ago. I was camping at a friend's property in South Texas. I am asleep in my tent and all of a sudden I wake up in the middle of the night. One of those from dead sleep to wide awake in half a second moments. I can feel something outside the tent, but I don't want to look. I have considerable camping, hiking experience, so I'm not freaking out too badly. I very slowly unzip the top of the tent, being as quiet as I can. I look out of the tent and there is very little light. We were camped under a giant oak tree, so big the branches dipped down and connected with the ground before growing back up again. It is a huge tree, and there are lots of shadows and weird shapes. Anyway, as my eyes start to adjust, I realize there are about 40 or more coyotes all milling around the campsite, just slowly walking around, sniffing here and there, almost ghost-like in their quietness. I slowly zipped the flap back up and laid there for about 30 minutes before I fell back to sleep. In the morning, in the light, you couldn't tell anything had been there. The next night we heard the pack howling for hours in the distance. That was almost freakier than seeing them 10 feet away. And finally, number 1 now, we have Burnt. This one comes from Reddit user Beer and Oxytocin. It's pretty grim, so maybe skip this last one if you're very squeamish. They said, I'm a ranger, a non-peace officer, and I work at a pretty remote desert park. This happened before I got there, but the other rangers I work with were there. They went to do a patrol during summer, our off season, at one of our seldom used campgrounds. On a patrol, our maintenance ranger found a burnt out car on one of the many sites. The desert is a weird place, so he just calls the sheriff and waits. The sheriff arrives, and it turns out there's a body in the driver's seat with no arms and no legs, just a torso and head burnt. The sheriffs just marked it as a suicide and removed the vehicle. We are close to Mexico and get a lot of illegal drug traffic coming through, so I guess they don't even bother trying to solve those. Super sketchy.